For years, Thomas Sinclair ruled the courtroom like a king. He was the defense attorney that no prosecutor wanted to face, ruthless, arrogant, and undefeated. But when he walked into this case, he thought he had already won. He saw a woman sitting quietly in the courtroom, just another secretary, nothing important. Or so he thought. But when the lead prosecutor failed to appear, that same woman stood up, walked to the front of the courtroom, and revealed the truth. She wasn't a secretary. She was Elena Carter, the new lead prosecutor. And from that moment on, Sinclair's entire career started to crumble. He tried every trick in the book. Manipulation, intimidation, misdirection. None of it worked. Because Elena Carter wasn't just another prosecutor. She was about to do something no one had ever done before. She was going to bring down Thomas Sinclair. How did she turn the case against him? How did she destroy his reputation? And in the end, what happened to the once untouchable lawyer? Stay tuned, because this is one of the most shocking courtroom takedowns you'll ever hear. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. Now, let's get into it. The courtroom was alive with energy as lawyers, reporters, and spectators filled the space. It was a high-profile case, one that had drawn media attention due to the powerful figures involved. At the defense table, a confident man in his late 50s, dressed in an expensive black suit, adjusted his tie. Thomas Sinclair, a well-known defense attorney, had built his career crushing prosecutors in court. His smirk reflected his belief that today would be no different. At the plaintiff's table, the district attorney's team was busy reviewing their notes. William Keaton, the lead prosecutor, was nowhere to be seen. The assistant prosecutors whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. And in the background, a young woman in her early 30s walked quietly into the room. She wore a simple navy blue dress, professional but unremarkable. Her dark brown hair was neatly tied back, and her expression was calm, almost distant. She carried a stack of files, her movements quick but controlled. To everyone in the room, she was a secretary, a nobody. Thomas Sinclair barely glanced at her. He was too busy enjoying his own reputation to care. And that was his first mistake. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise," he announced. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Wright presiding." Judge Wright, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, entered and took her seat. Her sharp eyes scanned the room. "Are both parties ready?" she asked. Sinclair stood confidently. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Silence. Everyone turned to the plaintiff's table. The assistant prosecutors looked at each other, confused. Judge Wright's brows furrowed. "Where's Mr. Keaton?" One of the assistant prosecutors cleared his throat awkwardly. Your Honor, Mr. Keaton is unexpectedly absent." Sinclair grinned. The audience murmured. The lead prosecutor was missing on the most important day of the trial. Sinclair took a step forward. "Your Honor, without the lead prosecutor present, I move to dismiss the case." Clearly, the prosecution is... A voice interrupted him. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." Sinclair froze. The audience turned sharply. The young woman in the navy blue dress had stepped forward, setting her files down on the table. Her expression was calm, unwavering. Sinclair stared at her. "Who is this?" Judge Wright narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" she asked. The woman lifted her chin slightly. "My name is Elena Carter," she said. Sinclair blinked. The name was familiar. Too familiar. And then she smiled. "And I am the lead prosecutor on this case." The room exploded in whispers. Sinclair's confident expression faltered for the first time. Judge Wright leaned forward. "Ms. Carter," she said carefully, "you're the lead prosecutor?" Elena nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." One of the assistant prosecutors stammered. Elena turned her head sharply, her gaze stopping him in his tracks. "A what?" she asked. The assistant swallowed. "A secretary?" Elena tilted her head slightly. "That's funny," she said smoothly. "I don't recall ever introducing myself as one." Sinclair's jaw tightened. He had laughed at her presence, ignored her, and now she was his opponent. Judge Wright exhaled slowly. Well, Ms. Carter, she said, I assume you have the necessary documentation to prove your role? Elena calmly pulled a sealed folder from her stack of papers and handed it to the judge. Judge Wright opened it. Inside were official documents confirming her appointment. And right at the top, a signature from the district attorney himself. Judge Wright's expression shifted. This was real. She looked back up at Elena. I see, she said. Then let's proceed. She turned to Sinclair. Mr. Sinclair, you may begin your opening statement. Sinclair's grip on the table tightened. He had walked into this trial thinking he had already won. Now, he had no idea what he was up against. Sinclair took a deep breath. He wouldn't be rattled. So what if the prosecution had changed? He was still Thomas Sinclair, the best defense attorney in the state. He straightened his jacket and turned to the jury, flashing his usual charming smile. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth, you are about to witness what should be a very straightforward case. He gestured toward his client, a wealthy CEO accused of corporate fraud. My client is an honest businessman, Sinclair said, and the prosecution's case is built on assumptions and weak evidence. He smirked. And now, to make matters worse, we have a lead prosecutor who has been silent this entire trial, until now. He turned to Elena. Ms. Carter, he said smoothly, I must admit, your sudden promotion is quite the surprise. Elena met his gaze without blinking. Likewise, Mr. Sinclair, she said. I must admit, I expected you to prepare a better argument than that. The audience gasped. Sinclair's smirk vanished. This woman was not nervous, not overwhelmed. She was in control, and for the first time, Sinclair felt something he hadn't in years. Doubt. Judge Wright gestured toward Elena. Ms. Carter, she said, you may present your opening statement. Elena stepped forward, her expression calm, her posture strong. She didn't need theatrics. She didn't need to prove herself. She simply spoke. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this is not a complicated case. The defense would like you to believe my client is an innocent businessman. She paused, scanning the jury's eyes. But the evidence will prove that he is a fraud, a liar, a man who has manipulated the system for years. She turned, locking eyes with Sinclair. And today, that stops. Sinclair swallowed hard. Elena smiled slightly. The game had officially begun. And Sinclair? He was already losing. Thomas Sinclair had walked into the courtroom expecting an easy win. Now, he was staring at a prosecutor he had completely underestimated. Elena Carter wasn't shaking or flustered. She wasn't nervous or overwhelmed. She stood there, calm, prepared, and completely in control. And Sinclair? For the first time in years, he fell off balance. Judge Wright adjusted her glasses. The prosecution may call its first witness. Elena stepped forward. The prosecution calls Michael Davis, the former accountant for Sinclair's client. The bailiff opened the side door, and a nervous-looking man in his early 50s walked in. Sinclair's jaw tightened. He had hoped Michael Davis wouldn't testify. Because Davis? He was the key to proving his client's fraud. Davis was sworn in, and Elena approached him with an air of quiet confidence. Mr. Davis, she began, can you tell the jury what your role was at the company? Davis nodded. I was the head accountant. I managed financial records and transactions. Elena nodded. And during your time there, did you find anything unusual? Davis hesitated, and he took a deep breath. Yes, he said. Sinclair leaned forward sharply. Elena smiled. Go on, she said. Davis exhaled. I discovered millions of dollars in unauthorized transfers. The jury stirred. Elena nodded calmly, as if she had expected this. Sinclair, however, he was already calculating damage control. After Elena finished questioning, Sinclair stood up, buttoning his jacket with forced confidence. He walked over to Davis slowly, flashing his usual charming smile. Mr. Davis, he said smoothly, you were the head accountant for my client's company, correct? Davis nodded. Yes. And how long did you work there? 10 years. Sinclair's smirk widened. And yet, in all those years, you never noticed these unauthorized transfers until now. Davis hesitated. I did, but... Sinclair pounced. But you never reported them, did you? Davis shifted uncomfortably. I was scared. Sinclair, tilted his head. Scared of what, Mr. Davis? Davis swallowed hard. Losing my job. Sinclair nodded knowingly, then turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we have a witness who admits that for years he said nothing. He turned back to Davis. Why should we believe you now? Davis looked down. Sinclair smirked. But then, Elena stood up. Redirect, Your Honor. Judge Wright nodded. Proceed. Elena stepped forward, her tone sharper now. Mr. Davis, she said, you said you were scared of losing your job. Did anyone at the company threaten you? Davis nodded quickly. Yes. Elena tilted her head. Who? Davis exhaled. Mr. Sinclair's client. The courtroom gasped. Sinclair's smirk disappeared. Elena turned to the jury. Let me clarify. The reason Mr. Davis never reported the fraud was because he was intimidated into silence. She turned back to Sinclair, her expression unreadable. Tell me, Mr. Sinclair, she said, do you think fear makes someone dishonest? Sinclair clenched his jaw. Elena tilted her head. Or does it simply prove how powerful your client thought he was? The jury whispered among themselves. Sinclair adjusted his tie. This was not going how he had planned. Sinclair returned to his seat, trying to mask his frustration. Elena Carter had just flipped his own cross-examination against him, and the jury had noticed. Sinclair glanced at them. They weren't looking at Davis with suspicion anymore. They were looking at his client, and that was a very bad sign. Judge Wright turned to Elena. Call your next witness. Elena nodded. The prosecution calls Jessica Morales, a former employee who was fired after discovering fraudulent transactions. Sinclair's stomach sank. Not her. The door opened, and a sharp-looking woman in her early 40s walked in. Jessica Morales had been one of Sinclair's biggest headaches before the trial. Because, unlike Davis, she wasn't nervous. She was angry, and now she had a lot to say. Jessica was sworn in, and Elena wasted no time. Ms. Morales, she said, why were you fired? Jessica folded her arms. I reported financial fraud to my supervisor, she said. And 3 days later, I was terminated. Sinclair gritted his teeth. Elena nodded. And who fired you? Jessica's eyes locked on Sinclair's client. He did. Sinclair's client shifted uncomfortably. The jury was paying close attention now. Elena continued. And did he give you a reason? Jessica scoffed. He said, I was creating a hostile work environment. Elena's eyebrow lifted. And by hostile work environment, he meant? Jessica glared. He meant I wouldn't stay silent. The jury murmured again. Sinclair could feel it. His case was falling apart. When it was Sinclair's turn to cross-examine, he knew he had to fix the damage fast. He stood up, forcing a confident smile. Ms. Morales, he began, you were let go from the company. Isn't it possible that you're bitter? Jessica raised an eyebrow. Bitter, she repeated. No. Furious? Yes. Some jury members chuckled. Sinclair's smile twitched. He pressed forward. But you were fired for being disruptive, correct? Jessica's eyes narrowed. Disruptive? She said. I was fired for doing the right thing. Sinclair tried again. Maybe you misunderstood what you found in the records. Jessica leaned forward. Oh, I understood perfectly. She locked eyes with him. And I'll explain everything to the jury. Sinclair's stomach sank. Jessica turned to the jury and began breaking down the fraudulent transactions in clear, simple terms. The jurors nodded along, following every word. Sinclair sat down, defeated. His own cross-examination had backfired again, and now his case was hanging by a thread. As the court adjourned for the day, Elena sat at her table, reviewing her notes. Sinclair was frustrated. His client was nervous. The jury was turning. David Cole, sitting beside her, whispered, "You're destroying him." Elena smiled. "Not yet," she said. She closed her folder. "But I will." Thomas Sinclair had always been the smartest man in the courtroom. He had won high-profile cases, outmaneuvered seasoned prosecutors, and built a reputation that intimidated even judges. But today, he was losing, and it was because of a woman he had ignored. Elena Carter. She had walked into the courtroom as a nobody. Now, she was tearing his case apart. As court resumed the next morning, Sinclair could feel the energy had changed. The jury was no longer leaning in his favor. They were watching him with skepticism. And when they looked at Elena Carter, they saw competence, strength, control. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his courtroom, his stage. Yet somehow, the woman he had dismissed as just a secretary was controlling the trial, and he was scrambling to keep up. Judge Wright looked at Elena. "Miss Carter, you may call your next witness." Elena stood, unshaken and steady. The prosecution calls Linda Hayes, the company's former financial auditor. The doors opened, and a stern-looking woman in her late 40s walked in, her presence commanding the room. Sinclair's stomach dropped. Linda Hayes was one of the few people he hadn't been able to intimidate. She had been digging into his client's finances for months before she was suddenly fired. And now, she was about to expose everything. Linda was sworn in, then sat down, her posture perfect, her expression unshaken. Elena approached. "Ms. Hayes," she began, "what was your role at the company?" "I was the chief financial auditor," Linda replied. "It was my job to ensure all transactions were legal and properly documented." Elena nodded. "And in your time at the company, did you find anything concerning?" Linda glanced at Sinclair's client, then back at Elena. "Yes," she said without hesitation. The jury leaned in. Sinclair exhaled slowly, trying to keep his face neutral. Elena paced the floor. "And can you tell us what you found?" Linda adjusted the microphone. There were millions of dollars in unaccounted transactions, all funneled into offshore accounts. Gasps spread through the audience. Sinclair's client shifted uncomfortably. Elena pressed forward. "And when you reported this?" Linda's lips thinned. "I was fired the next day." The jury exchanged glances. Sinclair felt his heart pound. This was bad, really bad. When it was Sinclair's turn to cross-examine, he stood up, forcing a confident smile. He had to discredit her. It was his only chance. He walked toward the witness stand, hands in his pockets. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his voice smooth, "you claim you were fired because of your investigation. But isn't it true that your department was already downsizing?" Linda's expression didn't change. "I was the only one fired," she said. "That's not downsizing. That's a cover-up." Some jurors nodded. Sinclair pushed forward. "But there was no actual proof that my client ordered your termination, was there?" Linda finally smirked. "Oh, I'm glad you asked." She reached in her folder and pulled out an email printout. Elena smiled. Sinclair froze. Linda held it up. "This," she said, "is an email from your client instructing the HR department to get rid of Linda before she causes trouble." The courtroom exploded in murmurs. Judge Wright gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the document. She read it, then looked at Sinclair. "This email is damning, Mr. Sinclair." Sinclair felt his stomach churn. His client was pale as a ghost. He had just lost the jury. And worst of all, he knew Elena wasn't finished. At lunch break, Sinclair pulled his client into a private meeting. "This is bad," he admitted, voice low but urgent. His client wiped sweat from his forehead. "You said we'd win this easily." Sinclair clenched his fists. "I didn't expect her." His client slammed his fist on the table. "I don't care who she is. I care that we're losing." Sinclair took a deep breath. "We can still recover," he said. "We?" His client cut him off. "No, we're done." Sinclair blinked. "What?" The man leaned forward. "I'm taking a deal," he hissed. Sinclair's heart stopped. His own client was abandoning him. But before he could react, the door swung open. Elena Carter stood there, arms crossed. "Good choice," she said. Sinclair felt sick. She had already anticipated this. And now, she had won. That afternoon, court resumed. Sinclair's client stood up, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to accept a plea deal." Sinclair felt all the air leave his lungs. Elena simply smiled. Judge Wright nodded. "The court will allow it." She turned towards Sinclair. "And Mr. Sinclair?" Sinclair looked up, defeated. Judge Wright's eyes were sharp. "You're dismissed." The words hit him like a brick wall. He had just been kicked off the case. Elena had outmaneuvered him at every turn. And now, his reputation was damaged beyond repair. As the trial ended, Sinclair sat at his table, watching Elena Carter shake hands with the prosecution team. She had walked into this trial as an unknown. She was leaving as a legend. Sinclair clenched his fists. For the first time in his entire career, he had been outplayed. Later that night, Sinclair sat alone in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His phone rang. A reporter. He let go to voicemail, because he already knew what they wanted. To talk about how he lost, how Elena Carter had dismantled his entire case. And as he stared at the city skyline, he finally understood. He had underestimated the wrong woman, and it had cost him everything. Thomas Sinclair had spent his entire career untouchable. No prosecutor had ever rattled him. No case had ever slipped through his fingers. No opponent had ever outplayed him. Until now. And the worst part? He had done this to himself. He had mocked her. He had ignored her. He had treated Elena Carter like she was nothing. And now, she had destroyed him in court. The moment court adjourned, Sinclair made his quickest exit ever. His client had abandoned him, taking a plea deal. The media had already swarmed the courtroom hallways. And the headlines? They were brutal. Elena Carter stuns legal world, obliterates star defense attorney in court. Sinclair's unbeatable streak shattered. Once untouchable, now defeated. The fall of Thomas Sinclair. Sinclair clenched his fists as he read them. But the worst part? The reporters weren't looking for him anymore. They were looking for her. For Elena Carter. Because she was the story now. Meanwhile, Elena Carter walked out of the courthouse, greeted by a wave of cameras and microphones. But unlike Sinclair, she wasn't running from them. She was walking straight into the spotlight. David Cole, her assistant prosecutor, whispered beside her. "Elena, do you want to say something?" She thought for a moment. Then, she nodded. She stepped forward, her expression calm and confident, just like in court. "Elena," a reporter called, "what does this victory mean for your career?" Elena smiled. "This case wasn't about me," she said. "It was about justice." She turned to the cameras. No one is above the law. Not a CEO, not a defense attorney, and not the people who think their power makes them invincible. The reporters ate it up. Because Elena Carter? She was no longer a nobody. She was the woman who had taken down Thomas Sinclair, and the legal world would never forget her name. While Elena was rising, Sinclair was falling fast. Law firms were distancing themselves from him. Corporate clients were second-guessing hiring him. And the final blow? The New York State Bar Association had opened a formal review of his conduct, not for losing the case, but for his arrogance, his unethical tactics, and his behavior in court. For years, Sinclair had been protected by his reputation. Now, his reputation was the very thing destroying him. A week after the trial, Sinclair sat in his penthouse office, drinking whiskey, staring at the ceiling. His phone rang. An unknown number. He picked it up. "Thomas Sinclair," he said. A calm voice responded. "You underestimated the wrong woman." Sinclair froze. He knew that voice. "Elena," he muttered. She didn't confirm or deny. She just said one last thing. "This was your last easy win." Then she hung up. And Sinclair? He sat in silence. Because for the first time in his career, he had no comeback. Elena Carter had won the biggest case of her career. And yet, she was already thinking about the next one. Sitting in her new corner office, she reviewed a new case file. David Cole, her assistant, walked in. "Elena," he said, shaking his head. "The DA's office just called. They want you leading another case." Elena smirked. "Who's the defendant?" David tossed the file onto her desk. She glanced at the name. Then she looked up, her eyes sharp. "This one," she said, "is going to be fun." And just like that, she was ready to do it all over again. Because Elena Carter wasn't just a one-time victory. She was a force the legal world would never ignore again. Thomas Sinclair had once been the most feared defense attorney in the city. Judges respected him. Prosecutors feared him. Clients paid him millions just to keep their names out of the headlines. But after the trial against Elena Carter, everything had changed. And now, his career was slipping through his fingers. The legal world was brutal. When you were on top, people wanted to be you. But when you fell, they piled on to bury you faster. Sinclair sat at his desk, reading the latest headlines. Sinclair's empire crumbles after stunning court defeat. Elena Carter's victory marks a shift in power. Is Sinclair finished? Former legal titan faces ethics review for conduct in court. Sinclair's fingers tightened around the newspaper. He had lost cases before, but this was different, because this wasn't just about one loss. This was about his entire reputation. And reputation was the only thing that kept men like him in power. That afternoon, Sinclair received a series of calls, but none of them were good news. His biggest corporate clients, CEOs, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, were dropping him. "Tom," one of them said, his voice cold, "I just don't think we can have someone with your recent track record representing us anymore." Click. The call ended. Sinclair threw his phone across the room. These were men who had begged for his help when they were in trouble. And now, they were treating him like a liability. The same way he had discarded people who were no longer useful to him. For the first time, Thomas Sinclair knew what it felt like to be abandoned. While Sinclair was losing everything, Elena Carter was unstoppable. Her name was everywhere. She wasn't just being offered cases, she was being given the biggest prosecutions in the city. She was the new face of justice. Her phone didn't stop ringing. Law firms wanted to recruit her. The DA's office was offering her more cases. Even news outlets wanted to interview her. And the best part? She wasn't just being respected. She was being feared. Because if Elena Carter could take down Thomas Sinclair, then no defense attorney was safe from her. Sinclair had always played on the edge of the law. He had used intimidation, manipulation, and backroom deals to win cases. But after his public humiliation in court, people started asking questions. And soon, the State Bar Association announced a formal ethics investigation. The accusation? Unethical courtroom tactics, manipulating witnesses, disrespecting judicial authority. For years, no one had dared to challenge him. But now, his enemies were circling like vultures. And they wanted his career. Sinclair had built one of the most powerful law firms in the country. But power was a fragile thing. And the partners? They were done with him. At a private meeting, they sat around a dark wood conference table, faces blank, voices firm. "You're hurting the firm's reputation, Tom," one of them said. Sinclair leaned back in his chair. "My reputation built this firm," he snapped. The managing partner, a gray-haired man in his 60s, shook his head. "And now it's destroying it." A document was slid across the table. Sinclair stared at it. His resignation letter. Pre-written. "Final. You can step down quietly," the managing partner said, "or we'll vote you out publicly." Sinclair clenched his fists. He had spent his entire life climbing to the top. And now, they were pushing him off the edge. He grabbed the pen, and with a hand that once controlled the legal world, he signed away everything. That night, Sinclair sat in his empty office, a whiskey glass in his hand. His phone sat beside him, silent. No calls, no clients, no allies. He had built his career on power and control. Now he had neither. The door to his office opened. He didn't even look up, because he already knew who it was. Elena Carter. She walked in, her expression calm, unreadable. Sinclair let out a bitter laugh. "Come to watch the fall of a giant," he muttered. Elena tilted her head. "No," she said. "Just wanted to see if you finally understood." Sinclair took a slow sip of whiskey. "Understood what?" Elena stepped forward. "That power isn't about winning cases." She looked him in the eye. "It's about what you do with it." Sinclair scoffed. "You think you're better than me?" Elena didn't answer. She just smiled and turned to leave. Sinclair called after her. "You think this is over?" Elena paused in the doorway. Then she turned slightly. "For you," she said softly. "It already is." And with that, she walked away, leaving Thomas Sinclair in silence. For years, Thomas Sinclair had been untouchable. He had ruled the courtroom with arrogance and power, knowing that no prosecutor could ever challenge him. But now, he was nothing. A disgraced lawyer, a man without a firm, a name that once commanded respect, now reduced to a cautionary tale. And worst of all, the person who had taken everything from him wasn't another wealthy attorney. It was a woman he had ignored. Elena Carter. Sinclair had once dominated the media. Every high-profile case he won was front-page news. But now, every article was about his downfall. Thomas Sinclair disbarred after ethics investigation. Once powerful lawyer faces disgrace after landmark loss to Elena Carter. Former legal titan stripped of license. banned from practicing law. The disbarment ruling came swiftly. With his law license revoked, he could never set foot in a courtroom again. His former allies disappeared. His reputation was shattered, and the empire he had built for decades, gone overnight. While Sinclair was falling into obscurity, Elena Carter was rising to new heights. She had gone from an unknown name in the legal world to being one of the most talked-about prosecutors in the country. She wasn't just offered more cases, she was being given the hardest ones. And unlike Sinclair, she wasn't using her power for ego. She was using it to deliver justice. One night, as she sat in her office, reviewing a new case file, David Cole walked in. "Elena," he said, shaking his head, "you're everywhere." She looked up. "Good." David smirked. "The DA's office just promoted you." Elena blinked. "To what?" David tossed a letter onto her desk. She picked it up. "Read it." Then she smiled. It was official. She wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was now the lead attorney for high-profile cases. The same position Sinclair once held. But now, it belonged to her. Without his law license, Sinclair had no way to return to his old life. He was no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer wanted. His name had been erased from the world of law. One afternoon, he walked into a small, dingy law office, his hands in his pockets. A young defense attorney sat behind the desk, reviewing a file. He looked up, frowned. "Mr. Sinclair?" Sinclair nodded. "I need work." The attorney's face twisted in pity. "You're disbarred." Sinclair swallowed hard. "I can still consult," he muttered. The attorney hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair." He sighed. "No one wants your advice." Sinclair felt something break inside him. The world he had once ruled had moved on without him. And the worst part? No one cared that he was gone. One evening, Sinclair sat alone in a coffee shop, staring at his drink. His suit was still expensive, but it didn't feel the same. Because a suit is just fabric when the person inside it has nothing left. Then, the door opened. Sinclair looked up, and his stomach turned. Elena Carter had walked in. She ordered her coffee, her posture calm, composed, powerful, the kind of presence he once had. But now, it belonged to her. Sinclair tried to look away, but Elena, she had already seen him. She walked over to his table, paused. Then, she smiled. "Mr. Sinclair," she said smoothly. Sinclair swallowed hard. "Carter." She tilted her head. "How's life after the courtroom?" Sinclair gritted his teeth. She already knew the answer, but she wasn't here to gloat. She was here to remind him. That power isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. And once it's gone, you don't get it back. Elena gave him one last glance. Then, she walked away. And Sinclair, for the first time in his entire life, he had nothing left to say.